Thank you, Kerry. So it's always worrying when Kerry says that I know everything about something, because I don't think I know everything about myself, let alone any other topic in industry. So it's a bit worrying. But what I wanted to do just in 10 minutes is just to share with you a piece of research that we did at the end of last year. And it came about because a lot of clients were asking us, they were talking about agile sourcing. A few clients are also calling it modern sourcing, and just thinking about how does sourcing move. A lot of organizations that we work with are large tech companies, talk a lot about agile from a software development perspective, as Kerry had mentioned, and actually starting to think about, well, how does this apply, or how does the more agile principles with a small a apply to our sourcing approach. So we did a very quick piece of research last year, and I've just pulled a few slides from it just as a way of setting the scene. But I think that those of us who've been in the industry for a long time will recognize this. And Kerry, I mean, I'm with you. I've got 25 years as well. So between us, we've got 50 years. So I think we're well over 100 years of experience. But those of us who've been around for a while will recognize this in terms of the more traditional approach that we've always taken. So we identify the needs, the go to market, the evaluate the proposal, you then negotiate, and then an award, and then you contract and transition. And that's a fairly traditional approach that we see across many organizations that we work with. One of the things that we're seeing more and more as we think about the transition to actually more what may be called modern sourcing, and I'll get onto a bit more agile topics in a minute, but as we talk about sort of trying to modernize procurement, if you like, and sourcing, what we're seeing is there is a move, and organizations who are leading sort of the way are starting to think about, well, how do we even change this process? So as part of identify the needs, one of the big changes that we're seeing is that ensure the suppliers early and in-depth involvement in the needs identification phase. I think that historically you kept suppliers at arm's length because you didn't want them influencing the process, but there's much more focus on how do you ensure you're getting the suppliers involved early to be able to shape those needs, because once you then go to market, it's a lot easier to make sure that you're getting responses that are meeting your needs, and actually try to do as many things as you can in parallel. And that's where it starts to pull into maybe a more of an agile methodology. We also then have talked about, as we start thinking about the typical way of evaluating proposals, it's about thinking about, it's much more about a relationship than it is in the old way of, well, we'll score your assessment, but there's no dialogue, there's no relationship between us. We're going to score it very much on a spreadsheet, and that's what we're going to do. And actually thinking about actually how do you, without favoring any particular provider, you have to obviously be very consistent across all of the bidders of the process, but actually how do you get much more of a relationship based evaluation of that proposal? And then when you're looking at negotiation and awarding, then try to think about how do you standardize in negotiation and evaluation process through tools and templates. And I know there's a lot of focus also, and I think Kerry, you talked about this before, in terms of standard contract terms, as well as you start getting into contracting, and really be focused on only negotiating the things that are important and are vital, and actually trying to get standard terms agreed up front, all those type of things. So what we're seeing is a big focus from organizations who are leading the way in terms of even taking these steps to actually be a bit more flexible, if you like, and modernizing their sourcing approach. What we see is that the reason that people are doing that is because they see a lot of benefits in terms of updating that. So it's definitely that flexibility and continuous improvement. So not being so rigorous in the process means that actually you can accommodate late changes to the requirements. You can be much more flexible in that, because in my experience, sometimes when you start up an RFP process and you've spent months capturing the requirements, by the time you actually got them out the door, the business has moved on. And so how do you make sure that you're able to be flexible and actually keep continually improving the process versus it being, oh, well, we contracted for that a year ago, but the business has moved on, but we've already started the process, we've got to finish it. I think everyone's striving for that faster cycle time, because with the business moving so quickly, how can you actually get the process through quicker to actually be able to start making the impacts? If you're doing a procurement or sourcing activity, there must be a business value for doing it. Therefore, why then you want that happening quicker? And then also about team building and collaboration. So it can definitely help the teams internally. If you build collaboration at the procurement stage, then actually the teams are going to have to deliver it and work together to deliver and transition, are already familiar with each other. But then you can also start building those relationships with the suppliers that you may be working with as well. As we look at What we're seeing is also is something else that's happening from a modern sourcing perspective and trying to modernize the approach is that sourcing teams are starting to look at, well, what would we consider to be core activities and what are non-core activities, and focusing the team, if you like, the core team, on the activities that are going to be the most impactful for the process. So whether that's developing the category strategy, whether it's thinking about innovation, whether it's on about supplier management, whether it's through, if you're sourcing, it's the negotiation, it's creating the package, and it's evaluating the supplier, but looking to get other people within the function or even outsourcing to look at, well, actually, could we look at someone else who's doing spot buys or some of the data analysis? Or so how do you really focus a core team from a sourcing perspective on the core things that are going to have the greatest business impact? And again, these are just generic things that people, organizations that we work with that are looking at modern sourcing are trying to do to move from the traditional sourcing approach to a more modern one. As we then think about, okay, let's talk specifically about Agile. And again, this is just a very simple example. But what we've seen is actually that organizations are starting to think about, okay, if you look at all of the steps that you would follow in a sourcing process, what are the types of activities that you could do together or at the same time in that same window to try and make that process speed it up? But it's not all about speed, it's also about being able to take changes throughout the process, etc., being more agile, again with a small a. So as we see sort of the second stage, where that 6 to 8 week period would normally be very sequential in terms of describing the high level scope and SLAs, designing the solution, launching the RFX and go to market, and then supplier engagement. Actually think about, well, how do we do some of these activities together and at the same time? And then you start thinking, okay, and then you go to market, then you start getting into, okay, we've got to evaluate the proposal, we've got to evaluate the contract terms, we're going through BAFO and due diligence and designing negotiation strategy. I would argue also you could even be designing your negotiation strategy much earlier on in the process. You could even put it in the orange section, because I think you could be thinking about, okay, well, we know where we want to get to. Why are we waiting to that point to actually design a negotiation strategy? You can start to get that point. Even some of the contracting and transitioning, you could start getting agreements up front for maybe common terms for a master agreement. So what we've seen is that organizations are just starting to think about, when we look at a traditional project plan and the phases that you would do from a sourcing activity, where are the activities that we could actually look to do in parallel? What are the activities that we could look to shorten by doing them at the same time, getting ahead of the game? We don't have to wait to get to the point of looking to an award to do some of these things. And so that's the approach that we're seeing grow. And I think the purpose of today will be, we're talking much more about how people are doing that in the real world. And then the last slide I think I have is around, oh sorry, two slides. One is around, before you can go that way, I think that firms have to think about a number of things. So are your people ready to be able to do this approach? It's not just a case of saying today you're traditional, tomorrow you're going to be agile. It's a lot more complicated than that. Have they got the right skills? Have you got the right structures in place? You have to think about the processes that you have to follow. So are the processes going to allow that? Can you actually get approvals at the right time? Have you got the right processes for core and non-core activities? And then also, have you got the technology in place to support that as well? So if you don't use technology at all and it's very manual and Excel driven process, then are there technologies that could help you? But if you've got technologies, is it flexible enough to allow you? If you've got an S2P suite, then actually is that going to accommodate a more agile or modern sourcing model? So you do have to think about the people, process and technology parts before just going back to work tomorrow and saying suddenly we're going to be agile. And we would advise, and I'm sure that the rest of the panelists will maybe give some real examples of where that's maybe working or where that's falling down. And this is just the last slide for me, is around a case study. So what we've seen, and this is a public case study that Barclays had released, which is that they had looked to implement agile sourcing. So they transformed their team structure to create work pods. So they actually looked at, okay, 18 sourcing pods taken from about 150 resources with a mix of seniorities and different levels of procurement and expertise and diverse skills. And actually they then looked at, okay, how are they going to conduct each sourcing activity they're doing? They also then didn't actually only have to work on one sourcing activity. They may have been working on several, but really taking an approach of actually just having, instead of having the old traditional team model, they looked at pods with a right mix of skills and seniority, who could then work on particular sourcing activities, and they had all the skills within the pods to be able to complete that activity as quickly as they can. Because one of the times what we know is a lot of time for a sequential process, it's that you run into delays because the people you need next in that process are actually on another project. So thinking about how you align the resources differently actually enables a more agile sourcing project. So at Everest Group, we've got a lot more content on this area. I mean, we've got the full report here, which is available, but we just wanted to share, give you a quick overview, and then I'll be back for the panel discussion in terms of anything else that we can add. But Kerry, hopefully that was useful in terms of just what we're seeing in the market.